Good evening, brothers and sisters. As I begin this lesson today, I do so with eager anticipation that 1 week from today, we'll be able to gather together at our church building for the first time in many weeks, and I'm excited about being able to see some of you. I understand that when we do gather, we'll not be able to just run up to one another and hug and embrace and shake hands in the usual way. The existence of the COVID-19 virus is a very serious matter, particularly for some people. And so what that means is that there will be some who will not be able to meet together with us, and we understand that, and glad that we have the mechanism that we've been using to be able to worship together from a distance. Also true that we'll have to exercise caution for the foreseeable future to make sure that we are doing what we need to do and that we're physically okay. But looking forward to that time nonetheless. Dana and I have taken advantage of the last week or so to do some traveling. We got in the RV and went up north to Michigan and Wisconsin and Minnesota and other places that we've not had an opportunity to travel much, and we really enjoyed that time together. It's sobering to consider that about a week ago we were driving through the city of Minneapolis, Minnesota, of course completely unaware of some of the events that would unfold there in the coming days. Since that time, we have watched with horror as we've seen a man, a fellow human being, George Floyd, treated in ways that were completely lacking dignity and respect, inhumane acts that ultimately resulted in his death. And since that time, the horror has continued as we've watched on television and online people taking sides perhaps and trying to mourn the loss not merely of a person, as if that was not bad enough, but a loss of humanity. Mourning the fact that our society still has so many things wrong with it. What we see is not new, regrettably. It's the same issue or the same set of issues that human beings have been dealing with for centuries, as a matter of fact, practically throughout the existence of humanity. In Micah chapter 6, we read the words of verse 8, which ultimately are sort of a summary of what Micah has been trying to tell his people all along, the same thing that all the prophets were trying to tell the people of Israel, and that is, you cannot continue to disregard those things which God has called you to and expect there to be no consequences. He says, "He has told you, O man, what is good. And what does the Lord require of you? But to do justice, to love kindness, and to walk humbly with your God." Micah 6:8. Now, I doubt very seriously that anybody, both in Micah's time or in our time, would listen to those words and say, "That's a terrible idea. We ought not do that. I mean, we don't want justice. We don't want kindness. We ought to walk arrogantly before God without any regard whatsoever for the way of life to which He has called us." And nobody's going to say that. But it was true then, and quite obviously it is true now, that we are not living as God would call us to live. That the ways that human beings are interacting with one another are clear evidence that we are not hearkening to Micah's exhortation, even today. What happened in the case of George Floyd is yet one more marker of the fact that we are not living in the ways that God has called us to, as a society and as a church sometimes, and even as individuals. In Matthew chapter 23, as Jesus rebukes the hypocrisy of the scribes and the Pharisees, the religious people of his day, He says, "Woe unto you, scribes, Pharisees, hypocrites, for you tithe mint and dill and cumin, but have neglected the weightier matters of the law, justice and mercy and faithfulness. These you ought to have done without neglecting the others." Do those terms, those ideas that Jesus features in his comments there, do those sound familiar? They're essentially exactly the same thing that Micah called the people to centuries before. Justice, mercy or kindness, faithfulness, walking humbly before God. At least one of the things that we note from both Micah's exhortation and Jesus's is that religiosity and even personal morality are no substitute for compassionate engagement with our world. Certainly it is true that Christianity calls us to personal responsibility. I need to control the things that I do. I need to behave rightly. But it is also true that I am a citizen of this world and a citizen of a kingdom that is more powerful and ought to overwhelm this world. That means that I ought to be trying to make a difference. How do we do that? Well, the first thing, if we follow Micah's formula, is that we ought to do justice. Now, I don't know about you, but I'm inclined, when I think about the term justice, to think about a courtroom setting where someone has been accused of a crime, for example, and we perhaps do not yet know whether that person is guilty or not guilty. And so the evidence is presented and decisions are made ultimately, which we believe and hope will result in justice being done. If the person is guilty of the crime, he will then receive the consequences of that. If the person is understood to be not guilty of the crime, then he'll be able to walk out of that courtroom exonerated. That's what we hope will happen. That will be justice. And when we see things like we have seen over the last few days in the case of George Floyd, many people are calling out for justice. And rightly so. We ought to want justice to be done in that sense, but justice is far greater than that. Justice is about making things right. And even if it is found that this police officer or police officers were guilty of horrible things, and if they are brought to justice, as it were, because of that, even if that happens, that does not fix everything that's broken. There is still injustice in our world. What we want is for things to be made right. In Matthew chapter 12 and verse 18, Jesus, citing prophecies about himself in Isaiah chapter 42 verses 1 through 3, speaks these words, "Behold, my servant whom I have chosen, my beloved with whom my soul is well pleased. I will put my spirit upon him, and he will proclaim justice to the nations," or to the Gentiles. Jesus came to make something right that has been very, very wrong. And notice that while Jesus' immediate ministry is primarily targeted to the lost sheep of the house of Israel, at the same time he acknowledges that the ultimate impact of what he will do is supposed to make a difference in the world, even to people who are very different from him, the Gentiles, people who many folks in the world would say, these people don't count. They're not God's people. They're not like us. They do despicable things, and they lack understanding. Jesus is concerned about them too, and he wants justice to be done in their lives. Not just the kind of justice that says they've done unrighteous things, therefore bad things are going to happen to them, but justice which says they'll be given an opportunity to make things right. Jesus wants that for all people. We do not make things right merely by not doing wrong. Justice requires so much more than that. Notice the language as we see it translated into English, that we're called by Micah to do justice, not merely to not do injustice in our own personal decisions. There is a responsibility that we have to our world to try to make things right. Edmund Burke is often quoted or often attributed as the person responsible for this quote, though his language is somewhat different. But the quote that has come to us today is that the only thing necessary for evil to triumph is for good men to do nothing. In this scene that we saw on the news and online, we see George Floyd on the ground, an officer with his knee on the back of his neck, and he is obviously in distress. I'm worried about the officer that's doing that, but I'm also worried about the other officers standing around watching it being done, who have been called and who have expressed an oath that said that they will protect and serve. They did nothing. Others who are standing around the streets videoing these things and doing nothing. And maybe, can I say, many of us who've watched that and shaken our heads in disappointment, and yet will do nothing. Is this justice? Not the way that Jesus called us to justice, and not the way that Micah calls us to do justice. Remember, we do not make things right merely by avoiding wrong. We make things right by pursuing justice for those around us and using what means are at our disposal to call people to things that are greater and higher. This the Lord requires of us, that we do justice. Further, Micah goes on to say in Micah 6:8 that we should love kindness. The term that is translated kindness here, sometimes translated mercy, is the Hebrew word chesed, which sometimes is translated steadfast love. It might be of interest to us to be reminded that the person of whom this term is used most frequently is God Himself. Frequently in the Psalms and other places we see references to the chesed of God, His steadfast love, His kindness, His attention toward us, His persistent desire and action on our behalf. That means that when we think about what it would be like for us to love kindness, it must start with an appreciation for how God has treated us. I have such a blessed life. I am surrounded by things and people that make my life convenient and enjoyable in so many ways. That's not to say that I or anybody else, that we're immune to the struggles and challenges of this life. Certainly not. But we have been the beneficiaries of a great deal of God's provision. And we, as we appreciate that rather than taking it for granted, are made aware of someone who is very different from us and how much He does things for us. And His very example calls us to take a look, hopefully, at people who are different than us and to extend ourselves into their lives for their benefits. It's easy to be kind to people who are like us and people who do so many kind things to us or for us. But to love kindness and to extend it into the lives of those who are different than us, who have exhibited traits perhaps that we either don't value or just despise. That kind of love of kindness is far too uncommon. In Luke chapter 7, we read the story of Jesus' interaction with a woman in the house of Simon the Pharisee. And the woman comes in and gives Jesus a great deal of attention which Simon and others present thought that he should have repudiated. They even say, if this man were a prophet, he would have known what sort of woman this is who's touching him. She's a sinner. Jesus goes on to tell them a little bit about the power of forgiveness. This woman knew she needed Jesus, and Jesus knew that she needed Him. We see Jesus persistently exhibit an attitude of respect for all people, including those who are very different from him and including those who most in his society at that time rejected and despised. Again, Jesus' example challenges us. It calls us to look toward those who are different, people who are marginalized in our society, people who've been on the receiving end of injustice and harm, people who have not had the same opportunities that we have, people who don't get the same treatment that maybe we might get, and to love kindness, to exhibit steadfast and persistent love and mercy. These are things that God calls his people to. And when Micah spoke to the people who were making their sacrifices and going through their religious observances, but were omitting that kindness, were not behaving in ways that showed dignity and respect for those around them, God was not pleased, nor will he be with us if we stand idly by and fail to meet the needs of those who are other than us. We must love kindness. And finally, Micah says we should walk humbly with our God. In Philippians chapter 2, in this great passage, I refer to it a lot, I know, because it's just so powerful to me. In verse 5, we're urged to have the same attitude as Jesus has, which is challenging enough, but all the more so when Paul goes on to say, we're talking about a person who was equal with God and could have hung on to that, could have clung to it, but instead emptied himself and became a servant and ultimately paid the highest possible cost in order to exert that service and to make a difference in our world. Jesus' expression of humility is remarkable and compelling. He's walking humbly with his God. In 1 Peter chapter 5, in verse 5, after Peter has talked to the elders of the church, and he's turning to start talking to the younger men as well and trying to bring them into harmony with one another, he says, "Clothe yourselves, all of you, with humility toward one another. For God opposes the proud, but gives grace to the humble." Jesus exhibited humility in the way that he interacted with all different kinds of people. There was no pushing others around, no exerting power so that he could demonstrate the weakness of others. Humility, I will argue, is the ultimate antidote to all forms of prejudice and injustice. When we begin to think, I'm no better than anybody else, and before God, I am as weak and powerless and unimportant as anybody that exists, it's very difficult then to start lording it over others or using power to harm or to marginalize others. We need to walk humbly before God. And that means, among other things, that we take a look at the world the way that God looks at it. It levels the playing field, at least in our minds. It lets us start. Our playing field is not entirely level in this world, that's for sure. And we see clear demonstrations of that from time to time, just like we've seen this past week. But at least in our minds, and in the way that we go about engaging our world, we can demonstrate that we understand that there are two classes of beings. There is God and humans. And humans are not God. And no human is better than any other human. We need that kind of humility. And we need to see it not only spoken, but lived out. And we need to call our world to that kind of perspective. And we need to be dissatisfied until we see it pervading the interactions that humans have with other human beings. And until we begin to see that it causes us to be submissive to the God who made us all. Micah asked the question, and we ask it again as well today. What does the Lord require? And the answer rings out: to do justice, to love kindness, and to walk humbly with our God. This week, we will have multiple opportunities to think about the world in that way. In terms of our own personal actions and choices, yes, but also in the way that we speak to the challenges that are faced by our society. To not remain silent, to not do nothing, but instead to do justice, to love kindness, and to walk humbly with our God. May God help us. May He energize us and give us courage and compassion and wisdom as we seek to follow the exhortation that we've talked about today. I pray God will bless you this week and that He will use you to bless others.